As much as we'd like any infrastructure deployment to go without issues or problems, sometimes things go wrong, and in CDK and CloudFormation we get a choice about what happens when they do go wrong. So let's start off by simulating something going wrong, and then we can talk about the two options we've got. So I'm going to make a role, and I'm just going to use the name of the class or the construct without the alias on. If you want to import this in a particular way to get a certain alias, you're very welcome to. I'm just going to import it as is. And I'm going to call this test lambda role. And then we've got to give it some properties. Let's see what the error is. And it's saying it wants an assumed by property. So that's an iPrincipal, which is an interface. And then we can say we're going to pass it in a service principal. And then we're going to get this wrong on purpose. So we're going to say ecs.amazonaws.com. So that's not an appropriate principle for a Lambda function. It would have to be lambda.amazonaws.com, but that's fine. We want this to go wrong. Then we'll make a new Node.js function, which is a really nice little wrapper for making Lambda functions with bundling and bits and pieces in place. And we'll call this test lambda. And then we're going to pass in our role, and let's see what other properties it would like. So we're not getting a TypeScript error for other properties being missing, but it is likely that we need some other bits and pieces. So there's the entry function, entry here, which is how you get to the right file. And there's the handler, which is the name of the function that's exported within that file. That's runtime and other bits and pieces. So let's go with entry and handler. So let's set it up. So entry, and I'm going to import the path module, which comes with Node by default. And we're going to join together the current folder we're in, and then what should we call this? Let's make a folder called lambdas, and then let's call this one test, and then let's have index.js inside of that. Then our handler can just be handler. All right, let's give that a go. So let's make that file. So in here we want a lambdas folder, a test folder, and then an index.js. And then let's export a function handler. And let's just console log hello world. We're not actually going to run the lambda, so it doesn't really matter what it's got inside it, but we'll get a minimal example. Now, just as a note on this construct in general, the Node.js function will try and bundle things. And we don't want it to use Docker for that. We could do, but it involves having Docker running, which you got to have some kind of setup, or if you're using Docker machine, Docker engine, then you've got to have a license these days for commercial use. So let's just use esbuild, which it will automatically use if we've got it installed. So I'll install that as a dev dependency, and then if it does any bundling, it will use esbuild for it instead of the Docker alternative. So let's try and run a deploy, and let's see what happens. So we can say yes to that. Happy to have that role created. Okie dokie, great. So we've got a problem. The role defined for the function cannot be assumed by Lambda, which is as we expected because it's only allowing ECS. And then you can start to see in those error messages, I don't know if you caught them there, that we go from it being updating what we've got to a rollback. And then you see the status is finally update rollback complete. And we can actually see that in slightly more detail in the CloudFormation console. So let's go and find our stack. Oops, I've got to log in again. So you can see the final status here is update rollback complete. And let's look on the events tab. And you can see it from the beginning. Where are we? So yeah, we started an update. Where's the operation? Here we go. Here's the operation. So we started the update. We tried to create the role. We tried to update CDK metadata. Still to create the role here. We create the role fine. So that did succeed because it's a valid role in and of itself. It's just not valid for our use case. Then we're still creating the Lambda, and then here we go. Here is our error stating that it couldn't create the Lambda function. So that failed. And then when we've done that, when we try to create a Lambda function, or any piece of infrastructure really, and then something goes wrong, the default behavior is to roll back. So CloudFormation is trying to get us back to a known good state, something that we'll be happy with. And it goes through all these things, and it just undoes all the updates piece by piece. And then it deletes the Lambda function, which obviously it couldn't create, but it still has to go through the motions if you like. It deletes our role, and then there we go. Update rollback complete. So this brings some challenges to it, especially when you are doing development of your infrastructure. So one thing is that we haven't got one here, but it's very common that CloudWatch log groups get created as part of the production of a Lambda function. And sometimes those log groups aren't deleted, and so you're left with some trailing resources. But in this case, we're okay. That's fine. That's just an example of a case where some resources might be left behind, like a bucket or a log group or similar. The other one is that you might want to inspect the resource to see what happened to it, or what was actually wrong with it. So if we go and have a look for roles here, and yes, I will add, we'll add MFA for this account. It's just made for today's filming. If we went and had a look here, you see, oh, we've only got one page actually. So there are no roles here to do with our new Lambda function, because it was deleted immediately, deleted as soon as something went wrong. And so we can't inspect the role to see what was up with it. And it might be that in this kind of case, where it's a pretty trivial example, the role's quite simple, it might be all right just to have a look at it in a template. So let's go and have a look at for AWS IAM role. There it is. And you can see the assumption policy, and that'd be fine. But that's not always the case. Sometimes you do want to see it in the console, and try and see if you can work out what's gone wrong with it. You want to see things in the failed state, not in the rollback state in the previous one. So there's two things to think about. One is you might get resources that are left behind that it would then fail to try and create if it tried to make them again, like log groups or buckets or similar. And the other one is that you might want to inspect the infrastructure when it's in this failed state. You see how far it got and what it made, or what it managed to make. So if we run our deploy command, and I'm going to use the double dashes to say we're going to pass any following arguments to the command itself, to CDK, and then let's add a -- help. We've got a number of options on our deploy method, a ton of options actually. But there's only a few of them that we're really interested in. And that is, or those are, I should say, rollback. So we can have rollback or no rollback. And there's actually a little hint here in the help documentation. Iterate more rapidly with no rollback. And it says, do not disable this flag for deployments of resource replacements, as that will always fail. So that's an important caveat there. With the rollback behavior enabled, if we've got to delete a resource and create it to make a change, for example, let's say we rename an S3 bucket. Obviously, you can't change the name of an existing S3 bucket. You have to delete it and make a new one. If we wanted to do something like that, then we can't run in no rollbacks mode. It just won't let us do it. It'll always fail. But we can use that if we are doing some development stuff, some development work. And so it might be that you want to run with no rollback when you are working on things locally on your machine, or maybe in a pull request branch, but not when you're going to some further environment. So maybe when you get to even a staging environment or production environment, you probably don't want to leave the infrastructure in some failed state. You probably want to go back to a known good state. You might not have access to that environment directly, depending on how your team works and how your organization's security posture works. But for our stuff, for our testing, we can run with no rollback. So let's do that. Let's repeat the same deployment of some infrastructure that we know will fail, but with the --no -rollback option on. Just one thing I forgot to mention while we're waiting for this to deploy. A case that I should have brought up earlier was that rolling back can be quite slow. If you've got a lot of resources getting created, they take a little bit of time, then something fails, then it takes quite a while to roll back. That actually takes a fair bit of time. I've seen that take half an hour in a really bad case. So it could be that you're doing this not just to inspect resources that exist, not just to avoid conflicts if some resources are left behind in the rollback, but also to iterate faster, as the documentation suggests. Okay, so we get the same error again, as we'd expect. It's still wrong, still the bad change we put in earlier. But we can go to IAM, and we can open up roles. And then we can now see we have a new role. We have getting started stack test Lambda role. So it might be that we didn't spot this in the template, and then we have a look at the infrastructure in the console or with CLI or whatever you want, And you might say, oh yeah, look, no, that's not right. That's supposed to be Lambda. And then we go back to our code base. We fix the role like so, and then we run another update. And then there we go, there we're done. So we have our Lambda function and we have our role. So when you're developing locally, you might want to use --no-rollback when you're deploying. Because we're using a package script here, we add in those 2 dashes in the middle just to say that any of the following arguments are going to the tool we're using, not to npm itself. And we thought about those 3 cases for this. So one of them is you might have a deployment that would leave behind some resources if it got rollback, like an S3 bucket or CloudWatch log group. You might just want to speed things up because the update process and rollback process can be quite slow. And then finally, you might want to inspect the resources as they exist in the console after a failure. Now I will add one little caveat to working in this approach. And that is that if you have a deployment with a race condition in, if you've got quite a big complicated stack or set of stacks and something goes wrong sometimes and maybe the deployment fails out, I wouldn't see using this option as a means of getting it deployed, because it might be that if you keep trying it, if you deploy it several times using no rollback, you eventually get there. Eventually everything is settled and happy and works. I'd really encourage you to do one good full deployment from the previous state, if you like, to the new state without this option on, just to make sure that everything will succeed when you go to production. Let's say you have your pull request version, a staging environment and a production environment. Fair play if you want to use no rollback in the pull request. I think that's a great option to iterate faster. But then when you get to that staging environment, I would encourage you, especially if you're doing more complicated things where you're setting up dependencies between resources and similar, to do a version without the no rollback on. So basically with rollback enabled, just to make sure it all goes through in one pass rather than having to do multiple runs with no rollback. Something to bear in mind.